George Richardson had lived his life honestly. He worked at the factory, raised his children, and cared for his wife. Margaret was a strict but efficient woman, always composed, always tidy. Their marriage seemed unbreakable, like the old oak tree standing near their apartment building. But lately, George had started to notice strange things. Margaret would leave in the evenings, claiming she was meeting friends or attending a book club. When she returned, she seemed excited. Her cheeks flushed, and sometimes carried the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. George was not a suspicious man, but something inside him began to gnaw at his peace. One evening, unable to ignore his doubts any longer, he decided to follow her. Putting on his old coat and hat, he stepped out after her, keeping his distance. Margaret walked briskly through the streets until she reached an apartment building a few blocks away. After a quick glance around, she disappeared inside. George stood frozen. He knew who lived there: Richard Turner, an old family friend, a widower. His pulse pounded. He didn't dare follow her inside, so he waited under the dim glow of a street lamp. An hour later, Margaret emerged, adjusting her hair and glancing around before walking away. The next evening, George followed her again. The same pattern repeated, and then again. Unable to endure it any longer, George went to Richard Turner's house the following night. "George?" Richard looked surprised as he opened the door. "What brings you here?" "Where is my wife?" George's voice was tense, like a wire stretched too tightly. I don't know what you mean." Richard averted his gaze. Then, from behind him, a shadow moved. Margaret stepped into view, her face pale. "George," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" "I should be asking you that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but firm as steel. She hesitated. Richard sighed. "There's no point in hiding it anymore," Richard murmured. George's hands trembled. "No point hiding what?" Margaret looked down, unable to meet his eyes. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Richard cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "We never meant to hurt you, George," he finally said. "It just happened." George let out a bitter laugh. "It just happened?" His voice cracked. "After all these years, my wife sneaks around like a common liar, and you sit there pretending it's all an accident?" Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "I was lonely, George. You don't look at me the way you used to. You barely speak to me anymore." George's chest tightened. He had spent his whole life providing, making sure they had food on the table, a roof over their heads. Had he truly neglected her? Was that why she had turned to Richard? Richard took a step forward. "George, please, let's talk about this calmly." George's knuckles went white. He felt as if the walls were closing in. He had devoted his entire life to this woman. He had trusted this man. And now he was expected to understand? His stomach twisted, and for a moment, he thought he might be sick. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, their voices calling after him. but he didn't look back. The next morning, the neighbors found George Richardson lifeless in his apartment. A note lay on the table beside him. I couldn't bear it. Days passed. One night, Richard Turner's telephone rang. When he answered, there was only silence. He hung up, but the phone rang again. And again. Every night, the same thing. At first, he dismissed it as a prank, but as the days passed, the calls became more frequent. When he answered, he could hear faint breathing on the other end. Once, a low whisper escaped through the line. "You took everything from me." Richard stopped sleeping. Every creak in the floorboards made his heart jump. Shadows in the corners seemed to shift when he turned his head. He became pale, weak. He started seeing George in his dreams, standing in the dark, watching him with empty eyes. Each night, the visions became more vivid. One evening, after another sleepless night, Richard sat in his living room, trying to calm himself with a glass of whiskey. The phone rang again. His hands trembled as he lifted the receiver. "Stop calling me," he whispered. Silence. Then, in a voice that sent ice through his veins, "I'm right behind you." Richard spun around, but there was nothing. His heart pounded, his breath came in short gasps. He staggered back, knocking over the glass. The lights flickered. In the dim reflection of the window, he saw a shadow standing behind him. With a strangled cry, he turned, but the room was empty. He stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. His chest tightened, pain searing through his body. A week later, Richard was found dead in his chair, eyes wide with terror. Doctors ruled it as a heart attack, but those who saw the body swore that his face was frozen in a look of sheer horror, as if he had seen something that had terrified him beyond reason. Margaret left town soon after, but no matter how far she went, the whispers followed. The wind carried George's name in its howls. At night, when she closed her eyes, she felt a presence beside her bed. Sometimes she could swear she heard soft footsteps pacing around the room. One evening, as she was preparing for bed, her mirror fogged up as though someone had breathed on it. Slowly, words began to appear, traced by an unseen hand. "You did this." Margaret's scream echoed through the empty house. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, but the signs continued. Doors slammed shut on their own. Cold spots lingered in her home, no matter how warm the weather was. Her reflection in the mirror seemed delayed, as if another version of her existed just beyond the glass, watching. Sleep became impossible. Every time she drifted off, she woke to the sensation of someone standing over her. Her nightmares were filled with George, his accusing eyes staring through the darkness. She left the lights on, but even that didn't keep the shadows at bay. One night, in sheer desperation, she decided to leave her home and stay at a hotel. As she packed her suitcase, the power cut out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The floorboards creaked, slow and deliberate. A cold breath brushed against her ear. "I know what you did," a voice whispered. Margaret shrieked and ran. But no matter where she went, George followed. And he would not stop. Margaret wandered from city to city, but the torment only grew. Her health deteriorated, her mind frayed. The whispers turned into moans, the shadows turned into shapes. George was no longer just a presence. He was a force, binding her to a fate she could not escape. One stormy night, Margaret checked into an old, abandoned-looking inn on the outskirts of a forgotten town. As she lay on the creaky bed, rain tapping against the window, a shadow loomed in the corner. "You thought you could run," the voice rasped. Margaret turned, her breath caught in her throat. A cold hand gripped her wrist. The candle beside her flickered and died. The darkness closed in, swallowing her whole. No one ever saw Margaret again.